Order. And welcome this morning to the committee's first evidence session for its inquiry into the Digital Centre of Government. And I'm very pleased to welcome our first panel, which is looking at the achievements and challenges and lessons to be learned from previous government efforts in this area. And we're very pleased to be joined by two witnesses with great experience. And I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself a little as I put to you the committee's first question. And it's basically a simple question. And I'll ask Laura Gilbert to start and then Richard Pope, which is what would you highlight as your biggest achievement when working on digital transformation in government? Laura Gilbert.
My biggest achievement, I think, would be bringing in genuine tech experts at the top of their field from major tech companies, sometimes from universities, and building a almost purely technical team that's been able to really deliver improvements in public services.
Can you say a little bit about yourself and your background?
So my name's Laura. I have a bit of a varied career. I was initially a particle physicist. I had a brief stint in defence intelligence, 3 years in quantitative finance, and nearly 10 years as one of two directors and chief technology advisor for a medical tech startup. We sort of brought it through SME to acquisition, and then I joined 10 Downing Street in September 2020 as the first director of data science. So that was really trying to transform the way that decisions were made in the Prime Ministerial Office. We went from having lots and lots of Excel spreadsheets and occasionally photographs of tables as the data source to work from, through to I think about 8,000 live data feeds. So if you now go into Number 10 and it's now expanding across the whole of government, and you were to enter data.number10.gov.uk, you would see live data on how the government's performing, what we know about all of the services that are being run. And there's also a lot of live sort of interactive policy modelling for for decision makers. In late 2023, I was asked to set up the incubator for artificial intelligence. And this is, this technical team, and it was really building on the 10DS, the 10 data science sort of expertise in data science, but bringing in engineers, software developers, cloud experts, etc. And what we've done with that team, and I'm very proud of it, is gone for a really different model of how we deliver improved services. The tagline is radical transparency. So the team puts code out into the open. We're very, very transparent about everything that is being built, really trying to use it as an opportunity to have a two-way conversation with the public, reassure them that the kinds of things that government's building really are supposed to be for the public good and are in their best interests, and to give them better services and faster outcomes. And what the team is really trying to do is I always say, make government more human with artificial intelligence. You should get a service that responds to your needs. If you need to speak to someone, the kinds of tools that are provided get you to the right person faster and free up people's time so that they can do that. As of January, I exited Number 10, and I'm now running a program, AI for Government program, which is jointly between the Ellison Institute of Technology in Oxford and the Tony Blair Institute, but still advising the Department of Science, Innovation and Tech one day a week. So that's the brief background.
Thank you. You spoke about bringing engineers and technologists into Number 10 as being a change, and then you spoke about radical transparency as also being something new. So how was the incubator for artificial intelligence received within the Prime Minister's office, but by other departments? And do you think that there are lessons for the new GDS in that reception?
Yes, so it was technically based in Cabinet Office, but reporting into Number 10, and then it was MOG'd, so moved over after the election into DSIT as part of the digital transformation. In terms of how it was received, it's very similar to the data team, mixed responses. I think the civil service has a certain way of doing things, and they also have some preconceptions about who technologists are and the kinds of things that they do. So some of the first advice I got, very strong advice from sort of policy experts and advisors was that you need to hire, I remember a direct quote, at least 2 Whitehall Sherpas.
What?
For every technologist to wrap around them.
2 what?
Whitehall Sherpas, so generalists, because they would be needed to translate what the technologists were doing. And my pushback on that is that as a technologist, I think I'm a reasonable communicator, but I also think I can hire people that are able to both engineer and also communicate the value of their work, why they're doing it, how it works, and do that really well. So we had, I think you see sort of a split. So right at the top, particularly on the political side, I think people were very excited to see what you could do. Maybe they've had experience of seeing transformation before that's gone well. And sort of in the lower ranks of the civil service as well, there are a significant number of people that really want to learn, and they want to see things change, and they're maybe more au fait with tech. And we had this program I kicked off in January 23 called Evidence House, where people could sign up on a mailing list and they would be invited to hackathons. We had a big conference where 500 people brought laptops and just learned to code in Python from everywhere in the civil service, and usually a little bit more junior. And they would come and they'd work with these engineers, and some of the products the teams built, such as Redbox, which is now our sort of answer to ChatGPT really internally, that came out of a hackathon originally. So it was members of private office that suggested the idea and built a prototype with engineers, and then that's been taken forward and rolled out. There are also people that I think really very naturally struggle with the idea of data and tech people sort of wandering into their space. If you have been working in a certain way for a long time and you believe that you're the expert in how to do that, it can feel as though people coming in with very different skills and very different approach will disrupt your workflow, might make more work for you, and it can feel like a real risk and a threat. And I think we did get pushback in that space. And the other thing about the incubator and 10DS, they're central teams. So you're trying to reach into departments.
Yes.
You're trying very hard to work with them. It's not in our best interest to work against them. You really want to work integrated, and you want to support them and for them to have a good experience. But sometimes there's a lot of natural pushback against the idea that someone from a different team who's maybe come in on the basis of political rather than civil service backing, potentially.
Right.
To come in and try and change the way you're doing things. That's not always comfortable for people.
Absolutely, and I think you're raising a key point there, and I think we probably want to explore the difference between political and civil service backing and how we can achieve both in the future. But Richard Pope, I want to ask you the same question and give you the opportunity to say a little bit about yourself, which is, what would you highlight as your biggest achievement when working on digital transformation in government?
That's probably working on gov.uk. Back in 2012, so I was the first product manager on gov.uk as the original GDS was being set up.
Right, yes.
And from what we were building around gov.uk, the sort of team we built around that, we kind of scaled into what became a government digital service. Took a lot of the learnings from that into the government service standard, which I was also involved with, which has then subsequently been applied to digital services across the public sector.
Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as a civil servant, I also worked on various programmes across government. Having worked in GovUK, I acted as a kind of digital product mentor in various departments, including during the reset of universal credit, but I also worked on land registration and apprenticeships and various others. Since leaving the civil service, I'm now a freelance consultant and work with governments of both national, regional and local around the world, helping them with digital.
You mentioned universal credit, which was a big program and a transformation of an essential public service. What are particular lessons that the new GDS team could learn from your experience with universal credit?
Yeah, I think there's 3 broad learnings from UC. There's one around delivery and ways of working, which I think is being adopted hopefully with the test and learn programs coming out of the Cabinet Office, is that idea you need to start small and grow the team, grow your understanding of the service. The thing that's being tested and learnt about is not abstract things, it's a service used by real people. The second thing was actually around the design of services. So in digitising things, you change their properties, and you can't just digitise what's there already. So, for example, with universal credit, when you've got something as complex as universal credit, it's using data from lots of different sources, calculating people's earnings in near real time. You need to create tools that help people understand that. You can't just digitise the existing process. So I think as government's thinking about using using digital to create efficiencies, you can't just digitise what's there, you've got to redesign it. And the third thing is around transparency. And that's something that we didn't get in early enough to universal credit, but as I think the team have been doing more, as I've been following externally, is being really transparent about how the service works and how it changes, so that civil society organisations can really understand. Like, public services only get better through feedback loops. We need to, and digital can be quite opaque, so we need to make sure that the transparency is there so that the whole of society can help steer digital services.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Martin.
Thank you very much. In a former life, probably 6 or 7 years ago, I was a non-exec director at a DFT agency, and we had some interactions with the then GDS, so we're talking pre-pandemic. That was painful. It was really, really painful. What you're doing, Dr. Gilbert, sounds very interesting in number 10. How do you make that work outside of the personal space where you're actually trying to reach across the wider civil service to actually implement GDS, whatever GDS is these days, because I'm not entirely clear where it is right now, but it sounds it's in a better position. How do you get that going forward rather than having the painful interactions that we had some years ago? My background is as a IT architect in major telecom systems, billing systems, all that sort of stuff, putting transformation into that sort of environment. So it's something I'm quite familiar with from a professional background. And what was clunky. What you're doing now sounds quite radical, which is really good and it's impressive, but it requires, from what you've described, personal influence to make it happen. You can't do that across the entirety of government. How do you spread out into those areas? Sorry, it's a fairly clunky question. Learning from the sort of previous sort of GDS clunky working into a much more 21st, or dare I say 20th century way of actually doing digital transformation.
Is this to me?
To both of you, really.
Would you like to go first, or shall
I think it's worth reflecting on so GDS in its early days was creating influence through delivery, and it was hard, it was definitely hard to engage with other parts of government because there weren't the people with the digital skills necessarily there. That's radically changed now. Every department has got, or every sizable department has got really good digital people, certainly at the practitioner level, in a way that you don't see around the world, actually. I think the UK really, like central government in the UK has got an amazing amount of brilliant digital designers, technologists, researchers working for it. There's an amazing resource that just wasn't there a decade ago. So that's one big change. I think looking forward to the what's in the blueprint, I think this commitment to have senior digital people in every department at exec level, and to have these dotted lines to the GCDO, that can be quite powerful as well. But all those things weren't there a decade ago. It was very much a kind of show through doing, and sometimes that worked, sometimes it was a bit clunky. UC was very clunky to start with. That was a very difficult, initially a very difficult relationship between GDS and DWP, but actually out of it came probably the best digital delivery team in the public sector.
I think I'm slightly less optimistic, and I tend to be a very optimistic person. I think this is going to be very, very hard. Certainly in GDS there are a lot of technical skills, and there are pockets of real excellence throughout the system, but there is a lot of the people that I come across in government. There are many, many brilliant people, but there are a lot of people in probably quite senior digital data roles who I don't consider are technologists, data people. I wouldn't hire them. I think it's very difficult to hire technologists well. I think that the way that civil service hires is not suitable for this sort of purpose. It's really hit and miss. It's very easy to come in with a CV that has all the buzzwords and all the jargon and all the programming languages, and the system doesn't have a way to hire that actually assures that people do their jobs, really can do them. And And I think until that changes, it's going to continue to be very difficult. You have, in many places, a standard of digital expertise that is far, far below industry, and I think far below where it ought to be. So the way that I hire in the incubator, and in fact data science team everywhere, is through hands-on testing. And you were sort of saying, I'd very much agree, the learn by doing, and the doing has to be in the hands of the user. But, you know, to be in the incubator as an AI engineer, you have a 4-hour coding test. You have a, here we go, here's some data, here's an API, here's a problem to solve. You've got 4 hours, some kind of app, go nuts. And you can solve it any way you want, because we want people that can solve problems. And when we come in 4 hours later, and these people, their CVs are, you know, have the experience on it, we've assessed them, we know that they should pass the bar. They're going to be selected based on what they've done, how they've done it, how they communicate it. We're going to look at their code. We're going to figure out which model they used and why, and they need to be able to answer questions on it. When I hire a private secretary, actually exactly the same thing. You know, here's 5 briefs, make me a day pack, because that's what the job I want you to do. While the civil service is still, you know, doing sort of behaviour-based interviews and trying to apply that to technical roles, I think we will continue to have quite a problem. So my worry with the blueprint is they've sort of said, firstly, there's lots of great things about it, but they've sort of said, well, 10% digital skills. Will they really be digital? Would Google hire them? Because that's the standard that we should be going to. If you're going to run a country really well, you need the kind of people that you'd hire into Microsoft or, you know, even a tech startup to be at that level. And then the seniority is an issue as well. Very often we still have the case that the people who are in charge of technical delivery are existing civil servants who have been the Director General of something else. And there's a role free, and so the system says, well, this is available, you can go and do that. There's still a very strong view that you should be fungible, that people should be able to do anything. And in fact, I've had a lot of very good, you know, really senior civil servants. I was told to apply for the Director's Leadership Programme, which is a great programme, in fact. But the last interview question I had to get onto it was, if you want to be a Director General, you will need to be able to run policy teams. Are you prepared to do the upskilling necessary to be able to go and run policy teams? And I said, well, I like to learn, I probably could have a go at that, but I'd be terrible at it, and I'm very, very good at running digital and data teams. So I think the thing that needs to change here is the system rather than me.
So just to come in now specifically on hiring people into the civil service who would be hired by Google and OpenAI, say, isn't the salary differences going to be a barrier to that? Or are there other motivations that the civil service can play on to hire those kind of people in? Just briefly.
Yes, I really think so. So again, the incubator doesn't pay industry salaries. The pension is attractive, but you have to be able to give people salaries at a range where they don't feel stupid for taking the job. Is basically some advice I got from Emily Lawson. If people are taking a third of the salary and they've got to explain to their husband or wife why, you know, we can't have a holiday and the children aren't getting, you know, as much money as I could, and you can't do that. When people are younger and they've got a dream, they're prepared to take a lower salary. Or if you can get it to within that sort of 30% level and people can really see that they can make a difference. And this is what we did with the incubator. We sold a vision, come here and try and really change people's lives. And I think there's really something in the tour of duty idea, because when I joined, I thought maybe this could be a career. And actually, it's very difficult to go up as a technologist in the civil service. But as I went through, I thought, well, actually, I could do this for a certain number of years and walk away having done something. And if we get a lot of people who believe in that tour of duty idea, and if we could communicate to the tech community and say, come in for 2 years and fix this, then you can go back to industry, and that's a good thing to have done, and it will feel good on your CV, it feels good for you personally, you get experience of something different. I think there's a real sales pitch there, and I think we're starting to use it, but we could really beef that up. So I think there are a lot of people in the technology space who really do want to work on public good initiatives, and quite a lot of the time they've got a bit of money on the side. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on, I mean, from there, is DCIT the right place for the digital centre of government? Is that going to work?
Well, I suppose it remains to be seen. It is a big transformation. DSIT before the MOG was 2,200 people, of which I think 100 claimed some degree of technical skill. It was formed from moving policy teams from other areas. And in some cases, the reason for that change was because those teams had not perhaps done the job that people wanted them to do where they were originally. So it's a difficult basis to set up a department that you then want to pivot to delivery. And it's a very big culture shift, and I think you have to be careful. People are bandying around the word upskilling a lot. You can upskill from any background to be an AI engineer, but you have to have aptitude. You have to want to do it. You have to care about it. You have to understand data and statistics. If we just sort of go in and try and upskill a department, then what you end up is with people, again, who are not at the level they need to be professionally to do this. And that's where you end up with mistakes. That's when we have AI that is unethical. People never do that on purpose. They do it because they're not skilled enough. They've done it wrong, you know. So I think it is very difficult. And I think the Secretary of State has sort of announced the department when he arrived that he wants this to be a delivery department. So I think that they understand that that's the drive. But it is difficult to do. So I think what you really need to do with this digital centre is see it as a separate enterprise somewhat that's under DSIT, rather than expecting DSIT as a whole to all be really very integrated into this. And I think if the digital centre is very tech-focused and hires the right people, it could go very, very well. And there's no reason that DSIT couldn't support that, but we also shouldn't expect DSIT to entirely change its species as this goes along, perhaps.
Thank you.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I'm less worried about delivery. GDS can deliver. It's shown it can deliver. I think it can do more of that in the future. I think what I'd like to say on whether this is the right place is that, so digital is as fundamental to running a modern digital state as a finance capacity is. GDS, new digital centre, is going to need to be able to influence across the public sector.
Absolutely.
And some of that's going to be about delivering strategic things. It's also going to be making sure that we're getting good digital governance, that actually we're able to prioritise things that create value across the system. Most digital projects in government at the moment are attempting to do something that a department already does a bit cheaper. It's really hard to look across the system and go, actually, we've got duplication, we've got the opportunity to do something that has a multiplier effect. So, you know, is this HM digital service to kind of counter HM Treasury? I don't know. I mean, at the moment, it does feel like it's a smaller entity. I think it's going to need to be able to show that it can exercise that influence and across the system. I think the interministerial group will be telling if GDS needs some backing, is that as the ministerial group going to give it that? When it says, actually, we think on paper this business case says there's not a business case, but strategically for the UK, we think there's an important bit of work to do here. Is it going to back it?
I think that's exactly right. If it gets the right backing, it doesn't matter where it sits.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think, Ellison, you'd like to come in briefly.
Quick questions. Martin used the word clunky, and it sort of made me think that in the State of Digital Government Review, there was key challenges identified. So one, obviously, was persistent legacy of systems, and also cyber and technology resilience risk there. So in such a radical transformation across various departments, how assured can we be that you're not overlaying this radical transformation on shaky foundations, and we need to fix some of the basics first?
So I think you're absolutely right. There is a lot of... I mean, legacy technology is almost I don't like using that term. It lets people get off free. It was kind of like it was here when I got here. Actually, we should talk about like unmaintained technology. There's a lot of unmaintained technology that the government and the public sector relies on to do its job, and it's just not good enough at the moment. So there is obviously a job to kind of like think to improve that. We need to do that at the same time as delivering value for the public and value for public servants. One of the things in the blueprint that I think there's a bit of a gap in is, I think Burma Foundations is kind of pitched as being about cyber and about legacy. Actually, we need to be thinking a bit more holistically and thinking about digital public infrastructure. So what's the digital public infrastructure the UK needs to deliver the public services of tomorrow? And how can you invest in common capabilities that cut across individual bits of legacy technology? I've seen a couple of reports recently which are really, I think is something that's worth replicating, where researchers have looked at the data infrastructure in a particular area, so like in the court system or in the health system, and actually kind of going down to the database level and saying what data is recorded. Is this thing fit for purpose or not? We need to do that on a systematic basis.
Right. Okay.
Sorry.
Again, so on the flip side of that, you talked about unmaintained systems. So when you're building this radical transformation and you talked about ethical development, what governance structures are you putting in place so that the new systems we put in place do have maintained, and you've got proper process, including to decommissioning, updating and decommissioning? So what are your governance processes that you're putting in place or should be put in place?
Quite a detailed question, probably, and the governance needs to relate to exactly what you're doing. The data. There are well understood ways to do data governance, sort of software transformation, the ways that you do your penetration testing, the ways that you record, the way you're using the data. I genuinely think, because it could be quite a long answer to that, it again comes down to really the professionalism of the people implementing it. So the reusable point is very well made. You've got lots of legacy tech in lots of departments. We spend a lot of money maintaining, or in fact not maintaining it, every year. And what we probably need to do is make sure that Digital Centre is able to build something on the side that is unrelated, that you can then lift and shift over into, that's reusable across lots of departments. And if you have a very, very skilled technical team with the power and the money and the long time horizons in place where the budget's not going to get cut next year and reused for something else, you can do that. It is achievable. If you leave the system the way it is, then it's not going to fix itself. So it requires actually a massive investment, and a lot of that investment needs to be in very carefully ensuring you've got the right people in place and then believing them when they tell you the answer.
Great. Well, we are going to, thank you very much for that, Ellison. We're now going to come on to some of the costing issues, because we have seen the figure of 45 billion as the prize of to be saved in the digitalisation of public services. We haven't seen very much detail as to where that 45 billion is coming from, but we have seen a few bullets, as it were. How credible? Can I just ask each of you to say briefly how credible do you think that it is that 45 billion can be saved in digitalisation? Laura Gilbert, go first.
Wonderful. So I've seen sort of the methodology for producing some of those numbers, and a few different organisations, including one internally, have sort of come up with roughly that figure. The methodology is perfectly good. If somebody said to you, how can you estimate what the savings could be? It's a reasonable guess, but it is, of course, a guess. No, it's very difficult to measure. I think the thing with that 45 billion is that there's a sort of front-loaded part where there are easy gains that you can pick up and say, well, actually, if we did this thing, if we automated this, there's this many people, or there's this much time saved or money saved on quite big and sort of things that don't rely on legacy tech that you can just go in and implement. An awful lot of that is a long tail, where if you invested, this much for a year and a half, then you'd make a 1% saving, but actually there's an opportunity cost in doing that. You need a lot of people focused on it, and they could be off doing something else. So I don't think that there will ever be a point where somebody comes in and goes, here it is, we've done the 45 billion. I think that what I'd like to see around this is a lot more detail, in that, there's a list of 15, 25 things we will achieve, and we've got an evaluation of what that is going to do, and that's the target for this government. So I think I'd like to see a different number. The 45 billion is perfectly reasonable if somebody had said, come up with a ballpark estimate of what you could automate across the public sector, but I don't think it's the right question.
Thank you. Richard Pope?
Sure. There's this paradox when it comes to savings and digital, that it's really hard to digitise an analogue or partially analogue service and not save money. But At the same time, services that are, or projects that are predicated on saving money tend to create outcomes that don't work for the public particularly well, which is why I think that the learning from universal credit of this idea of like starting small and growing something is definitely the model to replicate. You will get the savings, government will get the savings, but actually if you start off by going, if we can turn off 4 of those and 4 of those, and then we're going to replace this system, and then hopefully we end up with a service that the public can use at the end of it, or public service can use, it doesn't tend to work. Starting small and growing works. The other thing to say about savings, I wonder if ministers have slightly painted themselves into a corner with AI a little bit, because it seems to be that AI has become synonymous with the savings, and actually does that, like, that's part of the picture. There are almost certainly opportunities for efficiency and savings through AI, but there are also through more traditional, if we can say traditional digital processes, better design. There's a really interesting project that MHCLG have been backing, creating new open source planning systems for local authorities. They've saved loads of time because they've designed something that works for council officers. I don't think there's any AI in it.
Right. Yes.
They've just designed a really good system that works for people.
Right.
So we need to make sure that that's in the mix as well. And we're really using the full scope of digital to try and find those things.
So there are opportunities which come from AI, but there are also opportunities which come from generally being more efficient and digitalisation of existing processes and existing services. One of the things that surprised me is that there was no mention of data cleansing in the blueprint. This is building on from the point that Ellison was making. Well, there's an old saying, isn't there, garbage in, garbage out, and the quality of data. What is your view on the quality of data? You talked earlier about the data infrastructure, and particularly in the context of the Sullivan report published last week, which highlighted the challenges in collecting and sharing data on sex and gender due to a lack of common definition of what each of those terms meant, and also when each or both of them should be collected. Now sex and gender are contested terms in certain quarters, but doesn't it suggest that the government needs to have a standardised common definitions for data? And where is that work going on, if it is at the moment, that you're aware of? Could I ask? I'll start with you on that one, Richard.
I think going off and writing standards that end up just published on a website somewhere is not the answer. You get to those things through delivering common infrastructure. I think there's a few too many euphemisms in the blueprint when it comes to and metaphors when it comes to data. We've got the data library, we've got a digital backbone, we've got something else as well. It's like we're not talking about it for what it is. Like, what we're really talking about is data exchange systems for the public sector, the sorts of things that Estonia and Ukraine and India have really invested in. If you build that, again, starting small and growing it, you bake in the data standards, you bake in the ability for one department to trust that it's getting data from another one and know the format it's going to be in a predictable way. You get the transparency because you publish somewhere what data's held and what standards it meets. I was having a think on the way here today. I can think of 4, and I realised there was another one. There were 5 separate data exchange projects or initiatives that have come out of GDS or sort of central government as a whole in the last 10 years. I'm assuming the blueprint is kind of signalling another one. These things are very much long-term investments. They take decades. The government needs to pick something and stick to it.
I agree with all of that. A lot of these things are technical, including AI ethics. It's how you build it, and the data standards are the same. So where it's gone well, the health system did FHIR as a data standard internationally, and just if you want to share data, you have to conform to a sort of FHIR standard. But it's very practical. You can see that it looks like this, and so as a technologist, when you send the data, it's a technical piece where you have to fit the data into the slots, otherwise it won't go. Right. Rather than a piece of paper on a website that people struggle to watch or look at or engage with, particularly when they're busy. So that practical implementation is very important. I think also there is a real lack of clarity on what people are trying to do in the system. And I was quite concerned about the data library and have communicated that to a lot of people. Since I've been there 4 years, I think I've seen roughly, and I don't have the exact number, but roughly 250 million spent on data infrastructure programs. And the value of them has been, for a large part, really low and not far-reaching at all. I really don't want to see that happening again. And my concern with sort of the data library and the language around data sharing, very similarly, it's sort of quite metaphorically, there needs to be a very clear, why are we doing this, what problem are we solving exactly? The data problem that you could solve, it might be data exchange inside government. And that is, we're not talking personalised data here, we're talking about where the money is spent, what's it doing, what are the outcomes, where are the people, even that sort of thing that isn't currently, easy to access or shared. It could be about public data. So in the same way that, the transport data is released to the public and generated a lot of companies that then improve your travel experience, we could do that with a lot of government data. It could be about personalised data, and there's huge value from connecting up people's health records with their tax records and their welfare. But the pushback on that is that there are huge risks as well. And if you're going to do that, again, as you said, you need a 10-year plan. You need to be really confident that you're communicating exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. Just writing about data. The first thing that happened when I joined government was I was given a 200-page data document to sign off. This is the data strategy. I said, I'm the head of data science. I don't want to read it. I do not think in 5 years this will solve the problem, and it hasn't. So I'd really like us to stop doing that.
Thank you. Adam.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I want to come back both to some of the conversations we were having a little while ago about the new government digital service and drill down on a few of the kind of interior points of that. But kind of firstly, do you think, each of you, that the new GDS has got the right remit? Maybe Laura first.
I think that, it's a difficult one to get right. If you're going to fix the whole of public service digital infrastructure, that's a very, very big ask that would require more people, more investment, etc. So it needs to be bounded, which means that you need to have a sense of prioritisation of what you're doing. I think on paper the remit's largely good. It's maybe not the remit, it's the implementation that I'd be worried about, okay. I think is the answer. And the other thing I'd be worried about is how are we tracking whether it's delivering on that remit that, again, doesn't involve lots of written documents and involves actual outcomes, how much money has been saved, how much time has been saved. What is the public's experience of improved digital services? Are we seeing the outcome we want, which is that people feel that things are much better than they are? So I think that the remit's, has to be bounded by the budget and the people available and is reasonable. But I care more about the implementation, I suppose.
Yeah,
but Richard might have another.
Generally good. So bringing together lots of disparate groups from across government into a single place makes sense. There needs to be a strong centre of digital within government. There's a few very practical things that they've highlighted, and a few positives and a couple of questionable areas. I think the focus on administrative burden, measuring that across the system so you can choose where to act, makes sense. The commitment to digitise paper credentials, so not just driving licences, but the sum total of things that people need to prove eligibility for things, and the ability to mandate departments to create APIs, so you get that interoperability. Those are really kind of quite bold, system-wide things. That said, I think maybe some of this is down to GDS's prior history. It's still quite focused on this idea of citizen-facing services. I've got some questions about this, the focus on personalisation. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good place to start, but definitely the focus on citizen-facing things as opposed to businesses and the wider economy. So you're seeing lots of other countries investing in things like paperless invoicing and data exchange between government and companies. Digital identity for companies. It's not clear that at the moment. Similarly, I think the relationship it's going to have with local government is obviously evolving, but how's it going to how's it going to interact with devolved government? If we're going to have UK-wide digital public infrastructure, like how's that going to work functionally? So I think there's a few things to play out.
Brilliant. Thank you both. That's really interesting. DCIT has talked about their proposed account management structure. What does that phrase mean to you both? And do you think it's the right approach for the new GDS to take when engaging with different government departments? Maybe Richard first.
I've not come across that phrase, if I'm honest. I think, I don't know if Laura has.
Similarly, I don't really understand what it means either. I mean, I know, I imagine that it's supposed to mirror the way that Google has an account management structure where they have customers and they manage that relationship. So you've got a degree of one-to-one mapping where, you have a relationship with the department. That seems, it seems sensible. It could have a lot of overheads involved. The ways that goes wrong in government is when it cuts out the reusability point. So you need to be very careful about that. We have an account management structure effectively in Treasury for spending reviews, where a spending team works on this department. And the result on that can be that when the budget then comes out and you scan the whole thing all together, you can pull out, I won't be very specific, but you can pull out incidences where clearly this thing in this department is in fact the same as that. And there would have been quite a big economy of scale in doing it together, but no one spotted it. So I don't think it's a bad thing to do, and I think relationship managing will be crucial because people will be very uncomfortable in departments, but it's going to be, again, the implementation. Does it cut out reusability and a broader eye? And the alternative structure would be instead probably product specific, where there's a data improvement team, for example, that builds those APIs across government and then reuses them, and you focus on the technology rather than the account. And I probably have a slight preference for that. I don't know how you feel.
I think definitely the centre needs the capacity to spot emerging patterns and almost do like mergers and acquisitions on teams. And go, like, there's a team over here, we're going to put them, take them out of their departments and get them working together. I think there is a risk in if the relationship is only centred to individual departments, that makes it harder to create delivery capability that cuts across them. So if you want to create services that meet an end-to-end need for a new parent or a probation, someone leaving prison and going for the probation system, that's going to cut across multiple departments. If your lens is always on a department-by-department basis, you end up reinforcing that kind of Conway's Law problem. The missions are maybe the way out of that. We'll see in how those teams start to evolve. But if you can do that alongside creating teams that are cross-cutting and that they've got the backing to deliver outside of the bounds of departments, then maybe it could work.
Thank you very much, both. That's really useful. Maybe there's some scope, Chair, for us to take away seeking some clarity on what we mean by this account management structure, because I'm not 100% sure what it means, and we're not 100% what it means. But thank you both for those answers. A couple more questions from me. Are the initial Kickstarters that we've heard about the right areas for the new GDS to prioritise, do we think?
So the Gov UK app and the wallet, I think, feel very sensible to me, and of course work's already reasonably well underway on those things sort of through GDS. So it should be deliverable, it should impact people's lives in a positive way, I would say, and it's a good signal of sort of progress as well. Some of them are a little bit vague, sort of collaborations for long-term health conditions and disabilities. One would want some specific programmes of that. So it would be interesting to see what the early targets look like and how they're going to choose them. Good targets, but it's very non-specific. There's gov.uk chat. That's been underway for some time, and I think is a very normal thing that an organisation would do. How can you use AI to interact with, our system efficiently? Why not, really? The AI Accelerator Upskilling Programme, that is the one that slightly worries me, I think, for the same reasons before, helping digital professionals to become machine learning engineers. I don't quite know why you would do that. I think if you're trying to deliver more AI expertise, it's really, really important to find people that have the aptitude and want to do it. And if you have somebody who's an excellent user researcher, they should continue to do that because it's very valuable. So there's a risk of weighting everybody away from core digital skills, as Richard was saying, that fix the underlying infrastructure and some of the more easily addressable problems and some of the more annoying problems, and telling everybody, let's all move to AI. And if you are going to move to AI, again, I prefer the model where, as we've done in the incubator, we steal people from Microsoft and IBM and kind of, bring them in because they're state of the art. We're not trying to get people who sort of have a casual interest and turn them into experts. So that's the one where, and I also think when government has delivered those kind of upskilling before and tried to do it as a sheep dip, the levels of improvement you see are really not measurable.
Yeah,
so
sure.
That's the problem. And then the final one is, I think, government vulnerability scanning service. That I don't see why not. It's a solved problem, really. You know, that vulnerability scanning is a very well understood cyberspace. You could presumably, and again, you might know more about this than I do, sort of, if you know where all the services are, add them to a list and go through and penetration test the whole lot. But, I mean, why not have a central system that is assured, is owned by the government, that people really, really understand, that you can keep that internal, and that would help you to create a data list that says, actually, what are our reusable problems that we can solve where there's vulnerabilities across the system and try and fix them in one go. So I think that's something that should be achievable if we know how to do it, and implementing it is a good idea. There might be gaps in that, but I think that it's just a piece of work that's ongoing as the digital centre structure comes out and people don't yet understand the scope of the opportunity, and I think we'd expect to see that evolve.
Thanks, Laura. Did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see a much bolder list, actually.
Right.
I think it looks a little bit like some things that were already in train anyway. I don't know if it tests some of the bolder ambitions within the blueprint. I think encouraging things, I think the Wallets app, I think that could be quite transformational, again, if it can be positioned as a capability for the whole of the UK, not just a central government thing. I think we'll see how the GovUK app itself plays out. I really hope that they're doing the work to understand what departments need from that. I'd actually like to know what existing digital services could actually not be switched off, but like not have to run their own infrastructure anymore because the app is going to provide a bunch of functionality around forms, notifications. Like, what's the first few things that get turned off? So we know that there's a real value there. The other things, I really hope through this initial phase they get to revisit the Kickstarters and actually go and focus on it a little bit.
We're going to have to pick up the speed a bit now.
One very last question from me, if that's all right, Chair. Laura, specifically, you mentioned the incubator. And I'm curious as to, from your time working on the incubator, what were your thoughts and feelings about how it went, and then if there were any failures, and how could we learn from that moving forward? It's sort of, I'm very pleased with it, but I would be because I built it. So, you should ask other people, really. No, I think it really showed that government can do things very quickly, and that hiring the right people is possible, and that it's an effective way to go. Very, very fast. When you get people who really understand data and tech and just pick up a computer and build, you can solve specific problems incredibly quickly. And I think that every department needs that. So things that these incubators could do just to make departments function better, ignoring the wider public services to start with. You just need a quick app that sorts out this team needs a dashboard. This team needs an app that does something, really quickly, where they can, anything they're repeating, you can sort of build that and just shove it on everyone's computers and off you go. In terms of solving problems in the system, the things that worked really well were where there's ministerial backing for it, where you're going in and inserting an algorithm to replace an automatic, non-automatic process at the moment, or when you're building something that's really standalone. So there's something called Caddy, that the Citizens Advice we built with them, and they use it to improve the advice they give people, and the turnaround of positive case resolution's gone up about 60% using that system. So lots of it's really good. I think where it's fallen over, there are two things. One was that strong political backing, which means that when an election's called, there's immediately a hiring freeze. And that hiring freeze took about 8 months to unblock. So the team's supposed to be originally at 70, and you've had this, and that put a lot of pressure on people that really needed, big things to do, and that you needed specific technical skills that we hadn't managed to get on before the hiring freeze. And there were also issues, as I've alluded to before. There was one specific thing where we learned early on from, where the Prime Minister wanted it done, the Secretary of State wanted it done, the Director General SRO wanted it done, and the digital and data team in the department did not want it done, and they won.
And you got all the way through pilot evaluation, to a system that would work that was never implemented and probably won't be. So there's something in this for the future GDS where you're building standalone systems. I have very high confidence in their ability to deliver something like the app and the wallet. I really think they can do that. It's a standalone service they can do themselves. They don't need so much, investment for the rest of the government apart from permitting the data to go through. That can go really, really well.
We're going to...
Oh, sorry. Transforming departments is harder.
Thank you both. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks very much. We're behind time, but I think it's really important, and thank you very much for the evidence you're giving, but we do need to pick up the speed a bit. So, Steve, over to you.
Yeah, just wanted to talk on the tell us once principle.
Yes.
Whether you could help us to understand how that approach might change sort of adoption of public services, and can you give examples of what reusable data might be, and might it have had a different, if it was implemented at the time, of course some government might have had an impact on your work previously as well.
So tell us once is the idea that information there's various different forms of it, but either data is stored centrally in one place and is accessed by multiple services, or you have some kind of event-based system where a department gets notified and it tells everyone else when, for example, somebody's residential address has changed. How does that start to change services and actually the types of data first? If you look on gov.uk, all of the pages for all the services have got a thing that tells you your eligibility criteria. If you kind of go and copy and paste those into a spreadsheet, like I did once, with some help from some people, it's kind of the obvious stuff. It's address, it's age, it's qualifications for other benefits. So services as designed today, policies as designed today, tend to use those sorts of things. There are also some from outside the public sector, actually. So things like proof of earnings, things like right to work, proof of savings. So it's not just a central government thing. Some of them live in local government as well. So again, it kind of points towards a UK-wide digital data exchange system of some sort, or certainly interoperable ones. That said, I think the policies and services you design in the future, once you've got that kind of infrastructure, start to change. So the data we use today is not the same ones we'd use in the future. Just quickly on how it changes services, it's quite fundamental actually. So thinking to universal credit, a very complicated data-driven service designed by policy people to use lots of different data points about people. So you can do really, really specific means testing and specific targeting. That puts a lot of burden on the public. People spend a long time filling in those very, very long forms. And tell us once data exchange has the opportunity to remove that. You're turning it on its head and against you. These are the things we know about you. Tell us the things that are missing. Now, there are, as Laura said, there are definitely risk of unintended consequences there, which is where you need to design in understanding into the system. You need to so both the individual understands what's happening as best they can, and that civil society organisations have the opportunity to understand how things work. That sort of thing is not prioritised today. It's very hard for an organisation like Child Poverty Action Group to understand how universal credit, for example, works. So transparency's got to be part of the mix. But that's not a reason not to do it. Like, we really can save the public and public servants a lot of time. We can remove a lot of extra form filling, and we can start to make services that are much more proactive. And there's going to be challenges for government there, actually, because you're going to, is government going to choose to tell people that they're entitled to this benefit or that benefit? Political choices, ultimately. Technology enables it. It's going to be a political choice. It's also going to allow government and policymakers to target in new ways as well. So if you want to get people into health prevention schemes, for example, you've got the ability to target people. You've got the ability to proactively offer people access to services in a way that's just really difficult at the moment.
Fully transformative, and the thing that everything you said is exactly right. If you were to say that we're doing that now as a government, every government department would have to radically change the way they do things. You would have to digitise everything. You need APIs now. You'd have to agree to share things that currently departments refuse to share with other departments. There's no way to do it without that.
And is there an example of what sort of data they're free to share and why?
Well, so there are secure ways to do it. So you can do anything from a kind of checking system to the form-filling version. The form-filling version, you do have to have a way to share everything where, any department could access somebody's, I suppose, name, address kind of thing in order to pre-fill forms. There's also the kind of service where you go back to the initial department and check something. So if somebody says, I declare I don't have a criminal record, of course you can go and check and you get a yes or no answer. Those are very similar technically in that you have to have these automated data streams, but the implementation's different. Does that answer the question?
Great. Steve, I think you have another question.
I think that's fine on...
So thank you. I just wanted to bring up with you, we've talked about transparency and openness, and we talked about some of the perhaps the challenges in the civil service of applying that technically and culturally. The two key stakeholders, I think, perhaps I hope you would agree, in digital transformation will be the people, the workforce, and the users. Now, in terms of engaging the civil service workforce, we've been told that the Cabinet Office routinely discusses these issues, or the issues of digitalisation, with the unions. Was that your experience that there were, and was there other forms of effective workforce engagement, and what lessons could the government learn from the past?
I wouldn't have any idea whether Cabinet Office is discussing digitalisation with the unions. I presume they must be, but it's not something that was necessarily communicated. I don't remember any communications like that when I was there. I think there were real efforts made to communicate with civil servants. So there's a One Big Thing initiative. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was sort of started 2 years ago. One big thing is data, and everybody has 3 months to sort of do some data upskilling. I think it's a really interesting idea. A lot of effort went into it. Again, the implementation can be a bit off. People don't learn from watching videos. So spending quite a lot of money on a consultancy to come in and develop videos on what is data with a little arrow, and then you follow the arrow. I don't think that's an effective way to do it. So I think the will is really there. The one big thing this year will be AI, as I understand it. And I'm really strongly encouraging that what that should look like is giving people a device and saying, here's the AI, here's how you use it, here's how you generate a policy paper, and then here's how you make sure that it's right, rather than just talking.
I would say, I can't talk to conversations with unions or anything like that, but I would say one thing that works is designing, just in the same way as designing services for the public, you've got to involve them and understand what works for them and test them. You've got to do the same with public officials as well. Designing systems that work for civil servants and other public-facing officials, that's how you get to efficiencies. Just to point to one example I saw recently, there's obviously a massive backlog in SEND provision and EHCPs in local authorities at the moment. If you look at the software that teachers and educational psychologists and local council officers are made to use, it is awful. It is just dreadful. And they are losing hours and hours and hours of time using software that doesn't work for them at a time when we've got a shortage, or we've got a huge backlog and a shortage of educational psychologists. If you design software that works for them, which we know how to do, if only you apply the right people in the right sort of teams and you start in the right way, then you can save loads of time. But you've got to design it with people.
Exactly right. The hours you spend on just the HR software in government to try and manage your staff and pay people is unbelievable.
Right. Okay. And
as well, to be fair.
It's interesting that, whilst agreeing completely that it is the workforce that will drive the success of this transformation, we don't seem to have an understanding of the official ways of engaging with the representatives of that workforce, i.e. the unions. Just one more quick question for me, and I'll ask Emily to finish. We've talked about the savings, but we haven't actually talked so much about the funding. There's this thing called digital funding. We're trying to find out exactly what that covers. But in terms of the DCIT controlling or driving or engaging with their departments for the funding for the digital transformation, investment in new systems, etc., do you have recommendations on that? Or is that an issue during your time?
It definitely is, it is an issue because, of course, there's not enough money and people choose to prioritise differently. I do think a new funding, much in the same way they look at new ways to procure, new ways to fund this, might be quite useful if we genuinely believe that we are driving, this much benefit over this period of time. sort of a conversation with Treasury that looks like, if this much is saved, then can we put this much investment back in from that pot, separating the pots out for digital. And if we're not driving those sorts of savings, then we're doing it wrong. Okay. So there might be something in that space, I think, that could be useful.
I think the Use Digital Centre needs the ability to stop ad projects. A lot of the savings from the original GDS generated were from what's called spend control, just to be able to review upcoming digital projects and say yes or no to them. That capacity needs to exist. I think it's right that Treasury is experimenting with different approaches to funding projects, especially when it comes to digital infrastructure. The way you fund that is different. You need to be able to start small but fund for a very long period of time. Estonia, I know everyone points to Estonia as an example of digital government, but actually the thing people don't point to is it took a really long time. So the X-Road, which is their data exchange, didn't really create any value until they had like 50 services connected to it. And then suddenly you get the network effects. You've got to really fund these things for the long term, but hopefully you make those teams so they're set up in the right way and they're working in the open, so it's really easy to understand like when they're delivering value, when they're likely to deliver value.
And crucially on that, to stop things that aren't working, and government doesn't do that. Once it's funded, it carries on, and it carries on, and it carries on. And some of the things that we're doing now haven't been working for 5 years and are still being funded.
If you could write to us and tell us what those things are. Emily, would you like to finish the session?
Just a final question, for a chance for you to influence the future inquiries of this committee and hopefully government. On what should we be focusing on? And particularly, are there things that you proposed to the last government that you still truly believe are transformative, that were never taken forward, never started? This is your chance to pitch those projects again.
That's a good question. I think it's transparency, like repositioning transparency of digital services, not as a kind of nice to have, but as governance, as the way in which we understand whether services are working or not, and that's both for society and also for individuals. I think it's really important that the public have an opportunity to understand how digital services work and how they can change them.
How would that look to the public?
So we've kind of ended up adopting this kind of like West Coast American approach to design where everything's seamless and it just works. Actually, that doesn't work in public services. Public services only get better through public understanding of the system, and digital sometimes masks that. So practically it means helping people understand the institutions they're interacting with, helping them understand their rights and their underlying legislation, helping them understand when data is going to be moved from one department to another. Not in a way that gets in the way, but just helps people understand how their government works, in a way that private sector services don't have to think about, don't have to worry about. The other part of the question I've now lost. Sorry.
The other part of the question, projects you pitched under the last government that didn't get taken up, but you think this government should.
That was my thing that I was always banging my drum for, was more like greater transparency.
Fantastic.
I really agree on the transparency. I think things that I was very interested in digitising the spending review. I think that that's something that you should really do. I think that when you submit a request for funding in the budget, there should be a bit of a scan and it comes back and says, well, you don't have an evaluation plan, so we're not even going to read it. There's been a lot of work on trying to evaluate major government spend. The evaluation task force was set up, and I think about 8% of major spend was evaluated in 2019, and now it's roughly around the 50% level. I'd have to check the numbers. But there's still a long way to go on that, and if we are not evaluating whether or not the spend is driving the outcome we want, we're wasting a lot of money. So I'd like to see a lot more focus on, the evaluation of the spend. When it's not working, stopping and spending on something else. I'd like to see government basically run like a hedge fund where you're investing in certain things that, you invest in certain things that you kind of know will work slowly over time, digitisation, etc. Yeah. You have a few big pitches, but the things that you invest in and they do this, you stop funding them. And there's a variety of risk that goes into a real portfolio. Let's invest in some really risky things, but not unless we know we're going to stop doing them. And I think really digitising that spend process and much more transparency around it, inside the system and outside, could be really transformative. So if you're looking into things going forward, trying to get some numbers on where the digital spend has been and correlated them with what happened as a result of that digital spend, I think would be very informative.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very good ideas. Thank you so much, Richard Pope and Laura Gilbert. We've run a little bit over time, but that's a testimony to the fullness of your answers and the interest of the committee. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll now break here for the next panel. Order. One. Order, and welcome to this, the second panel in the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee's first session on Digital Centre of Government. And on this panel, we'd like to welcome our two new witnesses, and I'm going to ask Ellison to start the questioning.
Welcome. My first question is to yourself, Joe. Originally, GDS was housed in the Cabinet Office, which on the face of it made sense because it had the convening power to look cross-departmental. However, there was a challenge that it had 40 other things to do, as was reported. So it was moved to DSIT, which maybe is a little bit more specialist, but it has its own challenges to drive the reforms without that centre power base. So my question is, you have said that it's not clear whether DSIT is the right department to host the new digital centre. So what needs to happen for you to be convinced that it is?
Thank you. I just to start, I'd say I think the challenges are exactly as you've put them, and I'd say at the moment we're kind of we're relatively agnostic on what the right long-term home is. You know, it's kind of neither seems quite perfect. I think the things that would persuade us that either DSIT was the right home, the Cabinet Office was the right home, or some other kind of construction of the centre of government was right would be evidence that one of those is the best model for doing like the things the digital centre needs to do, the things that only really it can do, and those are kind of a combination of doing some of the setting of really core standards, things that you want to do once, you want to do for as much of government as possible, some of the things previous witnesses were just talking about, like data standards and transparency and interoperability, and like where the best place is to have the kind of driving force for the government's key priorities. And sometimes that driving force will involve stepping on a few people's toes. It's kind of impossible to avoid that, in which case you want to set it up in the kind of strongest possible place to get the right outcome.
Thank you very much. Rachel, my next question is to you, and I am going to slightly load my question by saying that it's a core belief that whenever you're doing any sort of transformation, particularly within technology, that you don't do stuff to people, you do stuff with people. And so Peter Carr mentioned that reassuring the public that privacy and safety have to be baked in from the outset, so we have to develop that trust with the public. So how can we give that social license to operate with the public and develop that trust? So what do you think the public really want from a digital transformation of public services? So are we doing what they actually want? And is there a balance to be struck between digital transformation of public services and actually retaining the public trust?
Lots in there.
Yes, sorry.
So I think there are two difficult things, really, for government to be thinking about. And one of them is that most people are not thinking about government most of the time. It's sort of like your difficult X, right, that you're not thinking about. And I think what we see in the blueprint is an idea that government wants people to be thinking about government a lot more than they are, right? And so the way that you win trust is by things working, and very often the problem is when something works, we don't really notice it, right? And that we only really notice things that don't work. So every time you're able to get a call back from the doctors that day, that's great, and you don't really think about it and don't notice it. Every time you're sent down like a pathway of signing into things and agonising, waiting, it becomes problematic. And so I think the important thing is to be delivering things for people that work when they're most vulnerable. And fortunately, what that brings with it is a lot of complexity. So, to give you an example of something I saw at the end of last year, I was at an airport in Europe, and there was someone ahead of me trying to get their QR code scanned, and it wasn't working. And we were in a place where there was a flight out of the country every other day, right? And if it didn't work, it didn't work. And there was no failover. There was no, if this hasn't worked, here's another thing and another thing, right? And so I think if we want people to trust things, we need to develop them with them. But equally, I think we need to understand that people's lives are hard, right? We don't want to be constantly, I suppose, creating new work for people to do to understand how government works. And I think, to Richard's point earlier, what needs to happen is that if we can design services in ways that help people to understand how they work, that, for instance, if you have to wait for 2 weeks to hear back, there is messaging, and that what I worry is a lot of the political messaging at the moment is that AI can just sort it all out, make everything magical, all those problems go away, and the likely gap between that ease that is being talked about and the reality of juggling things, it's not very glamorous, and I think that that's maybe why it's hard to address.
I think you made some very good points, and I will just pick up on one thing you said, is it's great to have these technical solutions, but we need to be careful that they do fail, and we need to make sure we build in quick and easy, effective backups. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Rachel Coldicutt, I'm struck by your statement, which I think is true, that the government expects people to think about government more than people want to think about government or do think about government. The fact is, though, that people do have, I know that from my constituents, a sense of a lack of agency when it comes to government and when it comes to technology as well. So the technology and government together have are sort of a combination where I would say people feel particularly powerless, and we need for the effective transformation, digital transformation of government, we need that to change. And the new GDS says it wants people to feel they have a voice, that they are listened to, and that they can play a part in shaping the services they rely on. And you've said how important it is that services are made with people. So how can we get people's voice as part of service design in order that the services that are delivered are more or what people want?
So one of the things that I think is very underrated is that when you're making a digital service of any sort, you're collecting lots of data about what people are doing and not. And that, we've definitely seen that GDS has been able previously to optimise based on how things are used, right? And that I think the first thing to do is to understand the data that government already has about things that aren't working. And so it can feel like a very good thing to do to automatically default to public consultation. But actually, lots of the answers are there, which means that when you do work with the public, you're asking them the things you really need to know. You're not asking people to go on a journey of 0 to 800 and making it work. And so I was, not last week, but the week before, helping to run a citizens' assembly in Liverpool. And I think, to your point, one of the things that we saw there is that the granularity of running the service and the jargon and the technicalities become very overwhelming to the people running those things and delivering them, right? And so when you get someone who is working in the weeds on a programme, coming and talking to members of the public about how that could be better, they're likely to start talking about things that people have never heard of or never thought about. And that actually people have much more developed ideas of the sorts of experiences they want at quite a high level. So most people want accountability, those sorts of things. And I think the trick is not to waste everyone's time by asking general things very often that never get delivered on, but by asking specific things and delivering against those and working with people to evidence.
Right, so specific use cases and indeed specific pilots of specific services that the public can engage with. Not to put words into your mouth, but I think that's what's part of what you're saying. What do you think of the DCIT's recent Digital Inclusion Action Plan?
I mean, it doesn't seem tremendously different from where we were in 2014, and I think it's not very imaginative, I have to say. And so there's like a couple of things in there. So on the one hand, like, if you're not a very confident user of technology, I can imagine the last thing that you would want is an old government laptop that someone had to operate with the help of IT. So that's the kind of thing that sounds nice, but it doesn't probably really help anyone at the heart of it. And that actually the thrust of it overall is like making the people work for the service, not making the service work for the people. Right. And so what I would really like to see is actually a kind of much more contemporary engaging with an understanding of what technologies look like in people's lives, right? So if you are a person who, for whatever reason, feels alienated and underconfident, probably the thing that will make you interested, like if say you don't want to do pension credit online, right? The thing that will incentivize you to use a technology might be talking to your grandchildren, not filling out a form, right? And that actually, I think we have to understand that sometimes digital won't be the best route for everything. And so I would really like to see something that is more about extending the fun parts of what the digital world offers, because I think if we want to include everyone, a really good place to start is to look at the minimum digital living standard, which looks at what a good digital life looks like and how more people are able to have one.
Thank you very much, Rachel Coldicutt. Adam.
Thank you, Chair. And Joe, a couple of questions for you now, if that's all right. Firstly, how do you see the role of the Cabinet Office and HM Treasury in delivering the new GDS?
So there are plenty of ways that both of those organisations are going to have to be involved, because the kind of transformation we're talking about involves, big cross-government policy levers, which the Cabinet Office tend to kind of secretariat control, and hopefully will involve some really good decision-making about the public finances to make investments, to make savings, like we've just talked about. There are kind of dangers for both of those organisations at both ends of the spectrum, and hopefully we'll kind of find a new middle ground which kind of delivers what's best. I think to expand upon what I mean, I think at different times, both the Treasury and the Cabinet Office can be kind of really quite overbearing for departments. There's a huge amount of kind of process, checking. I know from personal experience as a former civil servant on both sides of this, you can get to the point where there are kind of far more people cross-government who are trying to mark your homework on a digital project than there are trying to help you deliver the digital project. And at some point you think kind of, where's the help and support? At the other end of the spectrum, I think you can find that those bodies are kind of really conspicuously absent on some of the biggest kind of decisions. And if we take investment as a kind of key example, the Treasury is about to do a spending review. I was involved in several of them when I was at the Treasury, and the public finances kind of budget for technology in almost the opposite of the way that most private businesses would. Most private businesses really try and control their long run costs, and they're a bit more flexible about change and transformation costs, because you can always kind of change reduce your transformation spending if you need to. Whereas government tends to take the opposite approach. Departments doing a spending review submission will work out, what are my running costs? How many staff do I want to have? How much do I think I need to pay them? And then they'll bid for a whole load of other stuff. And when they get the kind of Treasury response in, what they'll tend to say is, okay, how many staff can I actually afford? And then at the margin, what little bit of transformation do I need? It's the kind of the complete inverse. And actually, I don't think the Treasury spends enough time saying, hang on, we're talking about a 10 million pilot here or there, or a bit of investment, but where's the real cost baked into the system, and how can digital help us transform that? The big kind of handfuls of expense in public services.
Thank you, Joe. Much appreciated. And then, as the Treasury and DSIC go through this process of reforming the government's digital funding approach, what do you think that the new GDS should be pushing for within that? And then, very specifically, what's your understanding of this concept, digital funding?
Yes, I might take that part of the question first, if that's all right. So digital funding has, kind of should mean what it says on the tin, which is how much we're spending on digital technology and the kind of both the kind of existing infrastructure that we have and the kind of transformation we want. There's kind of a bit more of a movement at the moment to formalise mapping, knowing what we spend digital money on, and some people have recommended creating a whole new spending category to capture digital spending in particular.
Can you just say, what do you understand by digital spending?
So the spending that the government has on the core technology infrastructure that it uses to deliver its day-to-day business, so cloud compute, some old on-premises compute as well, the kind of subscriptions which paying for applications that it runs on that, common components like database infrastructure, but also crucially spending on quite a lot of staff who are involved in building, maintaining, running those services, and that will comprise the whole gamut of different kinds of staff, and previous witnesses were talking about a few different of those people. So it's a big category, but depending on how you define some of those people in particular, these very, very large swathes of public spending, it's not particularly comprehensively mapped. And I think that exercises to do that to the nth degree, have been done over the years. They're always very stochastic. Every few years, someone says, we don't really know. Let's do that again. It takes them a very long time to do it, and they think, oh God, we can't keep doing that every year. And they probably should. We should probably have a common sense of how much is being spent on it. You asked, though, about the move to change it and transform it and what should de-sit, and I think the Treasury as well be looking at. We've researched and written a bit on this topic, and the initial direction from the Treasury on their review of digital spend, which they published 2 weeks ago, is really promising. But we'd like to see them go further. I think the key things they need to think about are a genuinely kind of risk-based approach to technology. There are very large amounts of government technology spending which are locked into these very, very long-term change programs, and it takes a year to write the business case, another year to get through all of the technology approvals, a year to procure from the company that's going to come in and buy it. They come in, they find that there are no in-house staff to help them do the work, and suddenly you're 3 and a bit years in. The technology's moved on in that time, that kind of and all of those things bake a huge amount of spend in. So the main reflection I have when I talk to former colleagues of mine at the Treasury, having now worked outside it on technology projects, is how expensive the government thinks technology is. It is much higher than it actually should be. There are lots of ways that the government can, do this more cheaply and more effectively, and often that's getting out of its own way on some of these processes. Like the reason we have all these really overbearing checks and balances is that we've created something through the checks and balances that is very expensive, very time-consuming, and then inevitably goes wrong. So that risk-based approach, I think, is really core. The only other thing I'd add is, and it speaks to something Richard was talking about a bit earlier, taking a different view of the kind of transformation of digital services and the ongoing run cost of the kind of current digital services that we've built and maintain. And often you'll find both of those things are lumped into a program with a whole bunch of other stuff in a way that doesn't make it easy to interrogate, but also people in Department of Finance teams, the Treasury, are routinely getting business cases to sign off where they ask to be explained it, and they're told, well, you couldn't not sign off this because it includes a load of the ongoing run costs of a big bit of government, in which case you think, well, what's the point of me signing off this? And so, both of those things, if we change them, it'd be really good and positive sum for everyone, but it takes the government getting out of its own way a bit.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Adam. Ellison.
So I'm smiling because your description of what it's like to do these things rung a few bells with me. Rachel, I want to talk about the government initiatives, the Kickstarter initiatives. I want to come to you first. So I've got some quite interesting ones: the government app, the wallet, the LLM chatbot, upskilling program, and vulnerability scanning service, and one that is a little bit vaguer, which is piloting improvements on how to better manage long-term health conditions or disability in the collaborations across government, which was flagged as being a little bit of a vague goal. So from your experience, when developing and rolling out these Kickstarters, what lessons should the new GDS learn from the rollout of new digital processes and tools elsewhere, particularly maybe within that collaboration across government departments with issues such as health?
Yeah, and I think there's something really interesting here in that there's a tendency in many of the proposals to think very big. And I think it's important to remember that cutting across lots of things isn't the same as being big, right? And so, for instance, making specific end-to-end journeys work for people who need services to join up across DWP and health and education, that may or may not be extensible to everything else, right? And I think there's this idea that with the time and the money that we have, government can be turned into a sort of a sort of galaxy brain kit of parts, and that everything will be really easy. And I suppose, to my point earlier, if we're specific about making specific journeys that are currently problematic for vulnerable people, that create lots of latency in the system, if those work, then we can build up from those. But it's much, much harder to say we're going to make everything better for everyone and then deliver those edge case needs. And I think that that both Richard and Laura previously spoke to the fact that these are all okay, but they're quite vague, and that actually, if the point is to feel that progress is being made, we could have a much more granular and specific list of things. And then in terms of understanding how they're working, I think there's a huge role here for qualitative research, because the thing about digital change is it can sometimes take years to show in aggregate. So if we're looking for metrics to be, everything going up on a graph, it might take years and years and years for something to be rolled out to deliver that sort of scale. Whereas actually being specific, being led with qualitative understanding and then evidence to roll out more could, I think, be a very powerful
Thank you very much. That was quite nice to look at sort of examples of the really difficult to solve journeys and experiences of people. So that's really, really interesting. Broadening that back up again in a way to Joe, do you think these Kickstarters are ambitious enough in their remits?
So I agree with Rachel. They're very large in their remit in many ways, but I'm not sure they are ambitious enough. And I think the common component to most of these, except for the health conditions and disability one, which you mentioned, which we can come on to, is that they're broadly all kind of levers that DSIT itself owns and largely controls. The gov.uk app and wallet, it's going to need some data and some support from other departments, but broadly these are platform components of what DSIT does that it can sort of spin up and control. Where I'd like to see more ambition and more focus is on digitization, automation, getting efficiency savings and productivity benefits in the big handfuls of where the government costs a lot at the moment. And those aren't often things DSIT can directly control. They are, in big frontline services, whether those are run by central government departments, frontline public services, local government, they tend to be the big case working functions, the big parts of frontline services. With the exception of that one, which I agree is quite vague and quite high level, we don't really see that come through here. So I think one of the reasons you probably don't see it come through is those tend to be, seen as the responsibility of those, DWP, HMRC, the Home Office, the departments in charge of those. But that is really where the biggest kind of bang for your buck is going to be, and that's where I think that DSIT should be exerting more of a role if it is going to be the digital centre and try to drive change. They can do that in collaboration with departments, with frontline public services, but to add up the big numbers, the big ambition in that document, that's where you need to look.
Okay, so in a way, it's not to be so guarded by the shiny new digital products and look at those sort of more fundamental, slightly more boring, but really transformational issues such as, Thank you.
So, thank you very much for that, Ellison. So, Reform has suggested 6 specific use cases. Is that what you're referring to, Joe Hill, which include updating basic tasks on gov.uk and providing AI chatbots in call centres?
So it's a combination. It's those particular use cases, although you'd find many of those use cases in most government departments, and with a particular laser focus on where you find those in the big, very expensive, frontline public services and departments, where that, there's often a temptation in government to announce or to pilot. Often because you've got a deadline to meet that you need to do the announcement or do the pilot in something which is kind of feels easy, often a new area or a very small area like, some of the use of AI in particular bits of policy making. And actually, whilst those are often the easier thing to do, they're not necessarily the biggest, hardest, and also most important. I'd just like to see a little bit more focus there.
Great. Thanks very much. Martin?
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was getting carried away in the answers and thinking. So in terms of looking at how GDS is sort of bringing all these different areas together and a challenge of sort of implementing common standards across hundreds of local government, central government, other sort of bodies and bits and pieces. Where should they be going, Joe?
So they should be going where I think there's a combination of the biggest kind of wins to be had, and where they think that in the short to medium term they can make the most progress most quickly. The government's often very tempted to boil the ocean. It feels like in the press release it needs to say something about everything, or it's gonna do a little bit for every department. Actually, that's a really common failure mode of these kind of big government strategies, because you try and do everything everywhere all at once, and then none of it really happens. Some of those things will be these big case working functions in places like the Home Office, DWP, HMRC, where it's going to be uphill and it's going to be hard. But if you can, make caseworker productivity a bit higher, if you can clear backlogs faster, you can stand to save the taxpayer a lot of money. Some of those functions, though, we also see mirrored in, NHS trusts, police forces, local government as well. Now, central government doesn't have the same kind of levers over those organisations to kind of compel them to change tack. And it needs to think a bit creatively about how it does that with kind of investment and deal making and bargaining. But I think this digital centre should set its approach up so that it can find those, not necessarily quick wins, but quick kind of short to medium term wins, action those very rapidly and move on to the next one.
Do you think they're doing enough in terms of identifying commonality or differences in data? We heard not long ago about how, you mentioned hospitals, how they measure missed appointments using the same notation for multiple different activities in terms of how appointments have been missed. So you can't actually compare data from across hospitals, let alone from across departments and across other systems. So the data language, the data lexicon, if you like, or the way things talk to each other and understand what they mean.
Standardizing data and the availability of it to access through kind of common APIs across government was the biggest win to be had 7-8 years ago, and still today is probably the single biggest win, although the kind of state of that landscape has improved a bit. And I think what's tricky sometimes is leaders in public services want to be using AI, they want to be seen to be operating at the absolute frontier, and then their technology teams tell them, you've got to fix those things first. I think that sometimes you can do both, and you can work quite iteratively, particularly you have good technical capability in-house, and you're not entirely reliant on procuring it, those long timelines we just talked about. But you do need to do some of the fundamentals, and also a bit like Richard was saying earlier about legacy technology. You can't see it as a kind of done, finished, we're never going to have to do that again. You are always going to have something which feels like legacy technology. You should always be trying to update it. No other company, or very few other companies, and certainly not technology companies, budget for, procure and think about their tech stack and their data in the way that central government does. I mean, they've all moved on to a much more agile way of doing it.
And where do you think GDS should start with procurement reform?
So there are probably two sides to this. One of which is, the early days of the kind of first incarnation of GDS were kind of the starting point for government building much more in-house digital capability and not always outsourcing things to the private sector. We've come a long way since then. I still think there is a way to go on that, and I actually think that may feel like a kind of kind of tension of interest between those two parties, but I really don't think it is. The most frustrating thing for private companies which come in and want to work with government, want to build good services, want to, get paid and get a reputation for being good, is when they come in and find there are no in-house people who can answer any of their questions about how to plug this in, and there's no kind of knowledgeable sponsor to work for. So the first part of being better at procurement is kind of continuing to build all of those digital skills internally to help work with private companies. I think that the second bit is just shifting the dial and bringing government procurement practices for tech up to date with the rest of the world. There are basically two components of that, one of which is kind of being more willing to use software as a service, to buy software by a license fee rather than to kind of buy a technology company to come in, build you one bit of tech now, and you're never going to have to replace it, because unfortunately, although I signed off lots of those business cases once upon a time, you always are going to have to replace it. It's kind of a myth. Most of the world has shifted to buying either whole applications or, more commonly parts of its digital infrastructure from private companies, using its own in-house expertise, putting those together. And government is just not set up to do that at all. Government buys very little software as a service. So that's procurement frameworks which are specifically designed to do that, which give them much more opportunity to try things before they buy, to have periods where they are testing and innovating and can ultimately say, actually, this doesn't work for us. And sort of the final part of it, which I think is really crucial, is incentivizing a bit more competition in these markets. I mean, much like the rest of public procurement, large parts of government tech procurement, there's only one bidder for the contract, or no one bids for the contract. In no sense are these things competitive. And I think we focus on the ends of the market, so really big technology companies, government strategic suppliers, and really, really small businesses, and often actually a lot of those end up being sole contractors, doing bits of consultancy. What the government really needs to think about is how it creates markets for, contracts for, and grows kind of soon-to-be ex-SMEs. We don't have enough focus on people who are at the top of that, who could one day be competitive and useful on the really big bits of government work. There's a real kind of hard cut-off where it feels like where you're trying to move on to much bigger frameworks. You can't demonstrate the size and stuff, and that step change they need to overcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Martin. Emily.
Rachel. So we talk a lot about this agenda in terms of the efficiency for government or the public experience, but actually it's a huge culture change for civil servants. So what, in your kind of view, do we need to do? And we keep hearing that the government's talking to the unions. What role should the unions be playing in this?
So something that I've been really struck by over the last few years is how normalised it has become for people in technology roles to say that the service is not fit for purpose. That seems to have become a new normal, and that I think there's something in there about there being two fundamentally different models of doing things. And very often, like in all the digital transformation work I've done over 30 years now, right, it's not about technology, it's about people, and it's about working together and building trust. And that never happens if we begin from a place where some people over here are saying the people over here aren't able to do the job, right? And so there's something about how might the culture of digital transformation within government be more sympathetic, right? And I know that is hard when innovation is deemed to be important and large amounts of money have to be saved. But in all the digital transformation work I have done, I generally find the people who know how to do the job will be the ones who will say immediately, these are the ways it could be faster, easier, these are the things that drive us up the wall. And rather than not asking those people and working around them, which will take longer, can there be a more collaborative way of understanding that? And I think as well, right, there's something about, I have now for, I'm going to say, 15 years, been in loads of meetings and workshops and read things where everyone is talking about the number of jobs that a technology is likely to displace or change. These things always happen much more slowly than whatever the marketing deck you're being shown, appears to indicate. And that actually, rather than, thinking about work I've done previously in healthcare, rather than thinking about it as being always about efficiency, I think it's better to think about it in terms of outputs. Mm-hmm. Because if we're thinking about what does a good service look like, ultimately there is nobody who wants to stand in the way of that. When you make it about efficiency, it becomes about people protecting their roles, which is, I think, not terribly helpful.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Steve.
Great, thank you. Just a question to both of you. The DSET had the blueprint for modern digital government. They're planning to develop that into the roadmap for digital and AI, published this summer. What would you both want to see kind of coming out of that sort of roadmap? And just secondly, what do you think DSET needs more of in terms of sort of skills, resources, in order to deliver that vision that's coming out? Rachel, first.
I mean, I think looking at the blueprint, what I'm really struck by is it feels a little bit like something that has been produced in response to the question, can we have a vision, right? It doesn't necessarily feel like necessarily a list of all the jobs that need to be done. And I worry that particularly around it being published, we've equally had a lot of political speeches that have indicated places where AI might be rolled out and other things that have happened, that actually begin to make the task list of the people in the digital centre of government become very, very long. The possibility of doing all those things becomes harder. And I think, to repeat myself, it's about specificity rather than saying, for instance, the idea that government might wrap itself around individuals with more personalisation is very, very vague. And it could mean almost anything. And that what I would really like to see is specific examples, use cases. I think as well, we don't like AI might not be the answer, and that was talked about earlier, and that potentially what I might even recommend is thinking about innovation might be something that sits slightly separately to delivery, because we've heard lots about the fact that maintenance is hard. It's very difficult to get money moving into things that are already working, and so possibly the danger of the plan that is about to come is that we might see more resource go into newer things rather than keeping everything moving. And I would hesitate to speak to the resource that is needed, but I think what I would encourage more is the idea that, I don't think that government needs to build a behemoth. I think it says in the blueprint that we could be looking at 1,000 people or something working at the digital centre. We know that agile, iterative working is the best way, and so rather than making it about consolidating everything, it would be really useful to see scaling up where other activity is happening as well, I think.
Absolutely. I completely agree with all that. On the question of what to add in, it's so tempting to kind of keep adding things to these things. The thing I'd like most is something which is simple, straightforward, articulates their vision, and doesn't feel like kind of hundreds and thousands of civil servants' time went into it. Because I'd much rather what they were doing was demonstrating like how far they've come since February. Lots of this stuff is very quick to build, it's very quick to do. The amount of time that gets spent on kind of big government documents for press release often kind of takes away and detracts from the importance of what they're actually trying to talk about. So that'd be my first part. Having said that, I think there probably are a couple of things it would be great to see. I'd like to see more focus on government doing things quickly in technology, more focus on speed, and particularly more focus on getting things to scale quickly in government. There's a phrase we use in our research about this, pilotitis, which is used to just kind of describe, it was an interviewee who originally said it to us, this kind of phenomenon in government where people will release strategies which mention technology projects, so they'll come to committees like this and talk to parliamentarians about technology projects. And if you mine under the surface, this is kind of a 3-month bit of software someone cobbled together, and there's a slide deck, and actually it kind of never goes anywhere because the budget never continues, whether it was good or bad. And actually, these things come and go, but the majority of government technology doesn't really change very quickly. And so I'd like to see the government trying to kind of buck pilotitis and actually get much more quickly from, is something working, can we scale it up, or if it's not working, can we just cut it off and end it, because that frees up money and resources and time for the things which matter. The other one, which we've highlighted a bit in our research, and I think is a controversial one, but I'd like to see the government taking on board, is a much more risk-based attitude to the adoption of some of these technologies. There's a kind of thing people say in civil service and in government, which is government's very risk-averse about any transformation or innovation. And I actually don't think that that's true, because the government's clearly willing to tolerate very high levels of failure in its current public services, most days of the week, open any newspaper. And I wonder when we talk about technology and, automated protocols that I've worked on or bits of projects where we're constantly shooting for the kind of 99th or 100th percentile of performance of a technology, a task which, probably human public servants do today. I sort of wonder whether that's a fair like-for-like comparison sometimes, particularly if the technology is much cheaper, much easier to roll out in public services where we have huge recruitment challenges. That's a difficult issue for the government to reckon with because it's to do with public trust and confidence. But I think in some of these areas, the difference is not, would the public like to see a public servant or have their query processed in an automated way? The difference will sometimes be, is it processed at all, or do they get no service from the state? And I'd like to see the government updating some of its guidance and attitudes on how it thinks about the risk and performance of particularly automated technologies versus like how public services work today.
Thank you very much. Just Rachel Coldicutt, you talked. I was struck by what you said about the critiques of the civil service as not being fit for purpose when it comes to technology. And following on from Steve's question, what would you like to see in 6 months' time, which you felt, within the roadmap, which you felt demonstrated that the civil service was had been brought on board and was valued as an agent for technological change?
I think actually there is lots of space to be celebrating the things that work, and so it's very easy, I think, not to remember that, UK government digital services are still widely regarded to be among the best in the world, and we're probably accustomed to that now. We've got used to it. And so actually, as I was talking about earlier, when things just work, they go unremarked on. And I think there's possibly an interesting comms challenge here about how can DCIT talk more about the infrastructure and the things that just work and the things that no one has to think about. Because actually bringing those up a little bit more into consciousness will, I think, help people to get more confidence in the ability of digital government to deliver.
Thank you. So we're just over time. I think Emily, you have a question.
Yeah.
I think we'll probably finish after with that. But
yeah, I think it's a good note to end on, actually. So one of the roles of this select committee is to hold government to account. What do you think the measures we should be looking at to evaluate the first 6 months of the new GDS? What kind of metrics should we be looking at? Should we be using?
Yeah, I can absolutely have a go. I think the key metrics are, first of all, is it helping hire really talented people into government to do some of this who otherwise probably wouldn't choose to come and work in the state? I think actually it's a bit of a unusual point. Salary, we talked about earlier, is very, very important, but also the branding of the kind of mission and who you're going to get to come and work for you and how. And actually, although it feels like a bad metric to be chasing, given where we are at the moment, I think GDS, one of the best services it can provide is trying to hire really some of the best people from the private sector to come and do some of these kind of tours of duty in government. The other ones would be, what are the kind of measures it's starting to put in place for frontline public services, the technology there around the speed with which things are going to be built, the scale at which they're going to be deployed, and the kind of relative performance I was talking about earlier of what performance are we willing to tolerate compared to the current performance of that public service rather than kind of absolute standards.
I wonder as well, right? The 6 months is not very long, and there's, as we talked about, there's a very ambitious slate here, and things keep being added to it. And I sort of have two conflicting thoughts about this. On the one hand, what is measured becomes the thing that is important, and people focus on that to the expense of everything else. Certainly some of those more complex, invisible things that might be a bit boring. But I would really caution against prioritising big metrics, right? And asking people to come evidencing huge savings and reforms really quickly, and then perhaps use the 6-month benchmark as a way to understand what feels useful to measure inside the team. Because I think very often when you start making things, what you expect them to do and how you expect them to work is not quite how they end up working. And that I think proper digital agile accountability might take account of that in a slightly different way to what we're accustomed to.
Thank you. Those were very considered responses. Thank you.
Yes, and a very good note on which to end with a considered response and a considered assessment of where we might be in 6 months' time. Thank you so much, Joe Hill and Rachel Coldicutt. It's been very informative to have you here before the committee today, and we'd like to thank you very much for your contribution. Order.